You bought the house because it looked like the American upgrade: a backyard, a pool, a clean lawn, warm nights, and the feeling that you'd finally made it. But in the next decade, those exact premium features may turn into liabilities you can't sell your way out of. Because the threat isn't just that water gets expensive. The threat is that water becomes uncertain. And once a city crosses that line, once supply can't be guaranteed, real estate stops behaving like real estate. It starts behaving like a distressed asset. Permits stall, insurance tightens, lenders ask new questions, buyers hesitate. And when buyers hesitate long enough, the market doesn't cool. It breaks. This isn't about saving your landscaping. This is about protecting what you've built: your equity, your mobility, your ability to refinance, your retirement plan. The housing market is trained to price cosmetics, but water is not cosmetic. Water is the hidden chassis the entire system rides on. And when the chassis cracks, granite countertops do not matter. In this investigation, I'm going to take you through 10 places where water risk is no longer theoretical, where the margin is shrinking fast, where regulators are tightening rules, where groundwater is being drawn down faster than it refills, where rivers are carrying less than they used to, and where the housing story people are buying is drifting farther from the physical reality underneath it. And here's the part no one wants to say out loud. In several of these markets, construction cranes and new communities are not proof of health. They can be the last phase of denial, a final sprint to sell inventory before constraints become impossible to ignore. A lot of people hear water crisis and picture a single dramatic moment. But the real damage usually arrives in stages. Stage 1, bills rise and restrictions start. Stage 2, development slows and new rules appear. Stage 3, financing and insurance quietly tighten. Stage 4, the reputation shifts. Stage 5, the exit becomes crowded and the bid disappears. That last step is where wealth evaporates, not because your home physically falls apart overnight, but because the market decides it cannot confidently price the future. And when a market can't price the future, it stops making offers. So if you own property in one of these areas or you're thinking about buying, listen closely. The goal here isn't panic. The goal is clarity before the rest of the market catches up. Let's start with number 10. Number 10, Orlando, Florida. Orlando looks like the opposite of a water story. You see wetlands, lakes, heavy afternoon storms, and enough greenery to convince yourself the supply is endless. But the picture changes the second you look beneath the surface. Central Florida's growth runs on groundwater, specifically the aquifer systems that have quietly supported decades of expansion. The issue isn't that there's no water underground. The issue is that we're treating the aquifer like a credit card with no limit. Aquifers recharge on nature's schedule. Cities withdraw on human schedules. When withdrawals outpace recharge, the system doesn't just dip, it changes. Pressure drops. Wells need to go deeper. Treatment costs rise, ecosystems suffer, and in some coastal or near coastal systems, you trigger the nightmare scenario: saltwater intrusion. Saltwater intrusion is what happens when freshwater pressure gets weak enough that saline water begins pushing into freshwater zones. Once that contamination spreads, you don't fix it with a home filter. You fix it with expensive treatment and long-term management. Or you don't fix it at all, you just shift the burden onto ratepayers and homeowners. Now combine that with growth. Orlando keeps adding people. More residents mean more daily consumption, more irrigation demand, more commercial use, more strain. Even if per person use declines, total demand can still rise simply because the base population is larger. Here's why this matters to the housing market. Water risk in Orlando isn't an apocalypse headline. It's death by carrying costs. Higher utility bills, new restrictions, bigger fees to fund new infrastructure, and then the subtle damage. Buyers start asking about water quality, not just school districts. Once that question enters a market, it doesn't leave. A city doesn't have to run out for property values to soften. It only has to become uncertain enough that the buyer pool shrinks. Number 9, Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's water story is what happens when a major metro is built without a massive natural buffer. Atlanta relies heavily on surface water rivers and reservoirs. Surface water is vulnerable to drought, heat, and political conflict. That means Atlanta lives closer to the edge than most people realize. The near crisis during major drought years was not a weird anomaly. It was a stress test. It showed how quickly the safety margin can vanish. Reservoir systems also face long-term erosion. Sedimentation gradually reduces storage. Meanwhile, population growth pushes demand higher. those forces move in opposite directions, capacity down, demand up. And then there's the political layer. Atlanta's water reality is tied to regional disputes over shared basins. When water scarcity rises, legal conflict rises, and legal conflict creates volatility. A court decision can change allocation expectations faster than a city can build new infrastructure. From a homeowner's standpoint, Atlanta's risk isn't that faucets go dry tomorrow, it's that the metro becomes a perpetual one bad season away market, one drought away, one ruling away, one emergency away. That kind of background risk changes behavior. It changes how insurers model exposure, it changes what lenders ask, and it changes whether the next buyer feels confident. In a healthy market, confidence is the lubricant. When confidence dries up, transactions slow. When transactions slow, pricing becomes fragile. Number 8, San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio is one of the clearest examples of single-source vulnerability. A large city leaning heavily on one major aquifer is a structural risk. It can work for decades until it doesn't, and when it doesn't, the fix is rarely cheap. Aquifers tied closely to rainfall can swing hard. In wet periods, levels rise. In drought, levels drop. If demand is steady or rising, the downswings get sharper and last longer. San Antonio and the surrounding region have made moves to diversify and reduce dependence because local officials understand the danger of betting the whole city on one geological system. But diversification costs money. Pipelines, new sources, storage, treatment, long-term contracts, political fights over rights. Here's what happens in real estate when a city has to spend aggressively just to keep water stable. Ratepayers pay. Water becomes a higher monthly cost. That cost doesn't show up in a listing photo, but it shows up in a buyer's budget. And as budgets tighten, affordability weakens. Texas growth adds another pressure point. Rapid population and economic expansion collide with finite supply. When that collision gets loud, water becomes a gating factor for development. Permits get tougher. Suburban expansion meets regulatory resistance, and growth, one of the key drivers of property value expectations, can slow. If you're buying in a long-term holding mindset, the question isn't, is San Antonio fine this year? The question is, what does the trend line force the city to do over 20 years? Because the trend line is what changes markets. Number 7, Denver, Colorado. Denver sells the image of stability, mountains, snow, rivers, and a strong economy. But the region's water reality is tied to a broader Western system that's under historic strain. A significant portion of the water that supports life across the interior West is governed by river basins and legal frameworks designed for a wetter past. When supply shrinks, everything gets contested. Allocations, priorities, transfers, storage, environmental requirements. In the West, water is as much a legal instrument as a natural resource. Rights, priorities, compacts, and court decisions shape who gets cut first and how hard. That means water security can't be judged by rainfall alone. It has to be judged by rights and obligations. Denver has invested in conservation and planning, but conservation has limits when the baseline supply declines. If less water enters the system over time because of changes in snowpack, runoff timing, evaporation, and heat, then even efficient cities face harder choices. Growth compounds the stress. Sprawl increases heat islands and outdoor demand and changes local hydrology. And in a region where water is already negotiated, growth can turn routine management into permanent conflict. For homeowners, the Denver risk isn't an overnight shutoff. It's a future where restrictions become normal, prices rise, and water-light housing becomes more valuable than traditional large lot lifestyles. That doesn't kill a market by itself, but it changes which properties win and which properties struggle. And when a market begins dividing into safe and questionable zones based on water, price dispersion can get brutal. Number 6, Salt Lake City, Utah. This is where water risk stops being a utility story and becomes a health and habitability story. When a major lake shrinks dramatically, you don't just lose a view. You expose lakebed sediments that can become airborne. Dust carries whatever is in that sediment, and once airborne dust becomes frequent, it impacts public health. Public health risk changes housing demand faster than most people expect, because it's not a political argument. It's a day-to-day lived reality. Air, quality warnings, asthma increases, outdoor recreation declines, the cost of filtration rises, and families with options start making different choices. The Great Salt Lake issue also exposes a broader truth. Water is part of an ecosystem. When the ecosystem breaks, consequences multiply on agriculture, on industry, on weather patterns, on air, on local economies. In a market like Salt Lake City, the long-term housing risk isn't just will water be restricted, it's will the environment become less livable in a way that changes migration patterns, because once the migration pattern turns, the real estate market follows, and reputational damage can be one of the hardest things to reverse. Number 5, Fresno, California. Fresno sits in the heart of an agricultural region that has leaned hard on groundwater as surface supplies have become less reliable. When groundwater becomes the emergency backup year after year, it stops being a backup. It becomes the plan. And when the plan is pumped more, nature eventually collects the debt. One of the most visible consequences is land subsidence, where the ground sinks because underground water-bearing layers compact. Subsidence damages roads, canals, bridges, pipes. It also permanently reduces storage capacity. Once those underground layers compress, you can't simply refill the system like a reservoir. California's push for groundwater sustainability changes the economics of the region. Less pumping means less water for some farms, which can mean fallowed land, job shifts, and economic pressure in communities built around seasonal labor and agricultural activity. That matters directly to housing. Housing markets don't exist in a vacuum. They depend on jobs, tax bases, and long-term confidence. If the economic engine slows and the water costs rise, a market can face both financial pressure and environmental pressure at the same time. This is what makes Fresno so important as a warning. It shows how water risk can physically damage infrastructure and economically damage a region simultaneously. Number 4, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque's story is about the limits of optimism. For a long time, growth relied on the assumption of abundant groundwater beneath the city. Later studies forced a reality check. Aquifers can be smaller, more complex, and less renewable than planners once assumed. To the city's credit, Albuquerque has emphasized conservation and efficiency. That's smart. But conservation is a stretching strategy, not a creation strategy. It buys time. It doesn't change geology. Albuquerque also faces the broader Southwest challenge. Rising heat increases evaporation and demand while reducing the reliability of snow-fed systems. When the climate baseline shifts, long-term planning assumptions get exposed. For buyers and investors, Albuquerque's risk is a slow tightening, more management, more restrictions, higher long-term costs, and increasing uncertainty about future growth. Real estate thrives on stability and predictability. A desert city can be stable if it has a reliable plan. The question is whether the plan remains reliable under a hotter, drier baseline. Number 3. Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles is one of the greatest engineering achievements in American urban history and one of the most exposed examples of imported water vulnerability. LA runs on water brought from far away through massive systems. That works as long as the sources remain reliable. But when multiple sources are stressed at once through drought, environmental constraints, legal conflict, and long-term basin decline, the city enters a permanent management crisis. LA can invest in recycling, stormwater capture, conservation, and groundwater cleanup. Those are important moves. But money doesn't change the physics of declining inflows. It can only optimize how the city uses what it gets. The early signals are already familiar. Emergency. Declarations, restrictions, public pressure, and political conflict over allocations. As restrictions become routine, the lifestyle premium that helps justify high prices becomes harder to defend. And LA has another problem. A high-price market has less room for new risk. When buyers are already stretching, additional uncertainty becomes a deal breaker faster. That's when the market starts to show fragility, not in every neighborhood at once, but in the margins first, then outward. If LA's water narrative shifts from managed to strained, the pricing story can shift with it. Number 2, Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas is the boldest bet against nature in modern American real estate. It is a major metro planted in an arid environment supported primarily by a single reservoir system fed by a stressed river basin. Las Vegas has done serious work on conservation and reuse. It has pushed measures that other places avoid. That buys resilience, but conservation does not control the two forces that matter most: the long-term decline of basin supply and the realities of reservoir evaporation in a hot climate. If allocations tighten and the reservoir continues to struggle, the city's growth model faces a ceiling. And when growth meets a ceiling, real estate meets a new reality. Boom city, valuation depends on the assumption of ongoing expansion. When that assumption weakens, the premium weakens with it. The real estate risk in Las Vegas isn't that the strip shuts down overnight. It's that water becomes a permanent constraint that changes what lenders, insurers, builders, and buyers are willing to do. When a city becomes water capped, the market stops behaving like a frontier and starts behaving like a closed system. Number 1, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix is the clearest collision point between modern American growth and water limits. It has been one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, built in a climate that regularly pushes extreme heat. Growth has relied on major infrastructure projects, complex legal frameworks, and decades of planning that historically reassured the market. But the margin is narrowing, and when regulators begin tightening standards for new developments, that's not a headline. It's the system quietly admitting that the old model of endless sprawl has reached a constraint. Phoenix carries compounded risk. Heat drives demand upward while supply stability faces pressure. The city's edges, where growth has been the most aggressive, are often the first to feel constraints because new subdivisions depend on predictable utility expansion and predictable long-term sourcing. If that predictability fades, the outskirts become a different product, not the next big thing, a higher risk asset with more questions attached, and questions are poison to real estate. Because real estate is not just a purchase, it's a financing machine. If lenders start asking harder questions about assured supply, long-term sourcing, and local policy, then the market doesn't need a dramatic collapse to suffer. It only needs fewer approvals, fewer loans, fewer qualified buyers. Phoenix is the market where the contradiction is hardest to ignore. A desert metro with relentless growth built on a water system that is now under intensifying pressure. When you can't refinance geology, your options narrow fast. What this really means for homeowners and investors, now pull back and look at what these 10 places have in common. This isn't just drought, this is structural overdraft. Aquifers pull down faster than they refill, rivers asked to deliver more than they reliably can, reservoirs treated as endless buffers, and long-term assumptions built on historical conditions that may not return. Water stress changes housing through 4 channels, and it tends to move in this order. 1. Cost. Water becomes more expensive. Treatment, infrastructure, rights, and long-distance supply all raise monthly carrying costs. 2. Rules, restrictions become normal. Landscaping limits, watering schedules, development gating, and emergency measures shift from temporary to routine. 3. Financing and insurance, quiet tightening begins. Higher premiums, new underwriting questions, exclusions, limitations, stricter lending standards in higher risk zones. Once finance tightens, market liquidity tightens. 4. Migration and confidence. When the story changes, when people believe a place is becoming less stable, demand shifts. The first exits are silent, then the exits become crowded. That 4th channel is the one that turns a risk into a wealth event, because equity is only real when you can sell. And selling requires buyers, and buyers require confidence. So what do you do if you already own in one of these areas? You don't need fear. You need a dashboard. Know your source. Know whether your city relies on one system or many. Track your local water agencies' long-term plan. Watch for regulatory signals, development pauses, new conservation mandates, rising infrastructure debt, allocation disputes, emergency declarations. If you're looking to buy, especially as an investor, treat water like a first-class variable, not a footnote. Before you commit to a 30-year mortgage, ask questions that most people never ask. Where does the water come from? Groundwater, river, reservoir, imported systems? Is supply diversified or concentrated? What happens during prolonged drought or heat? Are there existing restrictions, and do they trend tighter? Are permits and new developments being approved smoothly or being delayed because of water planning? What is the plan if the primary source declines? What replaces it? How much will it cost? And who pays? Because the core truth is not complicated. When water becomes unreliable, property values don't dip. Liquidity disappears. And when liquidity disappears, your home stops behaving like an asset and starts behaving like an anchor. This is not about doom, it's about refusing to be the last person in a crowded exit. If you take one thing from this, make it this. Stop judging a housing market only by what you can see. Pools, lawns, square footage, finishes, those are the surface. The real story is the system behind the walls: pipes, rights, sources, recharge, and policy. Because in the end, the most expensive house on the block is still worth nothing if you can't turn on the tap.